We made it. I'm starting to digest, I think. I want to start by thanking the Arab-German Young Academy and AUB for hosting probably the most delicious conference I've ever been to, but also I've really benefited from all the discussions and presentations, so it's been really a pleasure to be here. And thanks to all of you for coming out this afternoon and sticking through to the end. My paper asks how the Egyptian middle-class housewife, and specifically her role in the kitchen, evolved over the first half of the 20th century. But to start, I'd like to present a few fictional scenarios to set the scene. Number 1. It's 1915. A young Egyptian man, let's call him Hamid, is living and studying in Cairo, far from the village where he grew up, and where his parents are wealthy landowners. He is absorbed in his studies as well in debating great issues of the day, including the writings of Qasim Amin, who has famously written that women in Egypt must be liberated and educated. What Hamid loves most of all, however, are his vacations, which he spends at home in his village, where he delights in the joys of what he views as simple, country peasant life. In the city, he debates the hopes and possibilities of finding happiness, as-sa'ada, in marriage, but in the countryside, he witnesses happiness in the form of the delights and pleasures of peasant life, from harvest celebrations to traditional songs to the beauty of the landscape. Objects of his desire include local fresh fruit and beautiful peasant girls. His experiences with both can be described as pleasurable or delightful, laziz, as well as sweet or pleasant, halu. Number 2. It's 1925. A young man, Ismail, returns to Cairo from studying abroad. His family has sacrificed for years in order to pay for his medical education, and at last their son is back among them. Disaster strikes, however, when it becomes clear that with his new Western scientific knowledge, he now views his community's religious traditions as backwards and superstitious. He wonders how he can possibly marry Fatima, his cousin and intended bride, whom he now views as ignorant and unrefined. After much struggle, happily, he manages to find his religious faith once again. He realizes that he need not choose between faith and scientific learning, and he declares that he will take up the task of teaching and educating his cousin how to eat, drink, and speak properly, and they are married at last. She bears him 11 children. He opens a medical clinic that treats only the poor peasants from the villages surrounding Cairo, not the wealthy residents in Cairo, and these peasants bring him eggs, honey, and ducks from their villages as an expression of gratitude. He grows very round, he eats voraciously, and he laughs very often. Number 3. It's 1935. A young man, Kamal, falls in love with his best friend's beautiful cosmopolitan sister. He's somewhat confused when she refuses to eat because she's worried about her figure. But her brother explains that she considers herself Parisian, and that's why. Now, Kamal has a modern Western education, but all the same, this woman represents something very different from the eating and beauty standards of his family. Although his beautiful sister Aisha is a slender beauty, this is despite her eating habits, and not because of them. And in fact, her mother and the family maid were always trying to fatten her up with special concoctions. Kamal's father and his eldest brother took mistresses who were known for their full figures and voluptuousness. So words that could be used to describe them included lahem, shahm, duhin, so words for meat and flesh and fat. This is Naguib Mahfouz, so I didn't just make it up. They are the kind of women who can keep a man warm at night with her flesh. And this makes them objects of desire. For the women of Kamal's family, eating is not only about nutrition, it's about beauty and aesthetics. And this ephemeral creature that Kamal adores is something new and different, but also, sadly, by virtue of her class position, she's beyond his reach. Number 4, it's 1945. Leila, a young woman with a modern education, is subject to the strict norms of her bourgeois family. Her parents control what she reads and how she speaks. Nevertheless, she insists that girls have thoughts and emotions, and they must express them. And as a schoolgirl, she participates in demonstrations against the British, even though her father punishes her for doing so. She's devastated when the first boy she falls for makes sexual advances on a family maid. Eventually, Leila's best friend Gamila decides to marry a man she does not love. He may be old and somewhat unrefined, but he's wealthy. He can provide Gamila with a villa to live in, a car to ride in, and even a Butagaz stove in the kitchen. He can offer her new clothes and a cosmopolitan lifestyle. And all these things for Gamila add up to stability. And yet there are cracks in this veneer of choice and satisfaction. The day Gamila shows off her chic, low-cut wedding dress is the day of the Cairo fire of 1952. The very department store where she's bought the dress burns, as Layla and Camila watch from the rooftop. So scholars of Arabic literature or readers of Arabic novels will have figured out by now that I'm actually telling the stories of 4 canonical Egyptian novels. So Muhammad Hussein Haikal's Zainab, Yahya Hafiz's Indil Hashim, Naguib Mahfouz's Cairo trilogy, and Latifa Zayat's Al-Bab al-Muftuh, The Open Door. And my point in going through all these is not to string them together and suggest any kind of straightforward or coherent narrative, but rather to sketch out a basic semantic field to help me think about questions of domesticity, nationalism, class, gender, and of course, the kitchen. So in exploring these questions, I'm trying to arrive at more semantic understandings of these concepts as they emerged historically. So you can see here, these are just kind of groupings of phrases or words or examples from the sort of 4 scenarios that I described. And they're all tied to affective, emotional, or sensory experience. And in some way, they all connect to the kitchen. So I'll come back to these later, but I just want to show how I'm beginning to read these novels to think about these larger issues. And these represent one starting point for a project I'm developing that seeks to understand how gender roles, and particularly the role of the middle-class housewife, shifted in 20th century Egypt, and to understand those shifts in terms of affective, emotional, and sensory experience, starting with the kitchen. So this is very normative images of the kitchen from cookbooks from this period. And my goal is to understand how the modern domestic kitchen emerges as a place where not only taste, but happiness is produced. Of course, this raises more questions than answers. Which tastes? Whose tastes? Whose happiness? And how is happiness defined? They're rather big questions. So to begin answering some of these questions, I'm using both novels, as well as a very different genre from the same era, the modern Egyptian cookbook. So I've heard about some cookbooks emerging in the very late 19th century, and I haven't found any yet. But I've found quite a number, about 10 or a dozen print cookbooks from Egypt from the 1920s to the 1950s. So that's what I'll be talking about today, is this group of cookbooks that I found. So the earliest ones from the 1920s and 30s, were written by male Egyptian chefs who had trained with European chefs, either in Europe or European chefs who were working in Egypt. So these chefs had worked in palace kitchens or in the kitchens of large hotels. And they had learned, and I apologize for the quality of this, but this is the image, this is the author of one of these cookbooks. So you can see he's sort of a classic effendi with his suit and his tabouche, but he's in a very traditional French haute cuisine cooking outfit. So this was the tradition that these chefs were trained in. But by the 1930s and 40s, the majority of cookbooks on the market, so far as I've been able to discover, were written by women for women. So the question becomes, who were these women cookbook authors? These women were not trained by French chefs. So as we saw in one of the scenarios I described, Egyptian men, like Ismail, had been sent to Europe for over a century. It's a tradition of sending Egyptian men to Europe for education. And starting in the 1920s, many Egyptian women started actually traveling to Europe as well. And many of them studied cookery and domestic science. So when they returned, they wrote domestic science textbooks as well as cookbooks. And many of them worked in the Egyptian Ministry of Education to implement a modern culinary curriculum. Here's a menu from, this is from the 1890s. So you can see that the male tradition, the tradition in which these male chefs were trained, is a very classic French tradition. So I think on the first day we saw that in Berlin around the same time, sort of high entertaining, fancy entertaining would have been a very similar menu. So this is a medieval royal banquet in Cairo in the 1890s. Okay. So on the left is a 1926 article about a group of women, Egyptian women from the middle and upper classes, who are sent to England to study modern subjects. It's actually from the Siyasat al-Usbu'iyya, which is edited by the author of Zainab. And then here is an annual report from Gloucestershire, England's School of Domestic Science training. And as you can see, they had 2 Egyptian students in the late 1920s who graduated and went on to be employed by the Egyptian government. And I'll talk a little bit more about this training institute in the UK later on in the talk. So the audience of these female cookbook authors was a new figure, the modern Egyptian housewife. So at the same time that the male heroes of the novels I described earlier were leaving home to study, debating about the level of education their wives should have, and drawn to new models of feminine beauty, the figure of the modern housewife emerged not only in cookbooks, but in textbooks, newspapers, and elsewhere. And as the rich scholarship on gender in Egypt during this period attests, the housewife was not only a paragon of modern womanhood, she was also a key repository of difference in cultural authenticity. So while novels provide insight into sentiment and character, the cookbooks offer a different view, a very normative view, into the way that those housewives or potential housewives were instructed to balance their roles as preservers of Egyptian culture on one hand, and modern mothers and wives of a new nation of citizens on the other. For example, just to set the scene, this is a training kitchen for the Gloucestershire College of Domestic Science. So this is sort of the context where the authors of these cookbooks were trained. So one 1934 cookbook begins with the following introduction. Quote, "Many people think that cooking is easy and that any woman can do it as long as she has some experience in a traditional kitchen. But in fact, the opposite is true. Cooking and arranging the table are fine arts that require great effort and care. They are the basis of a family's happiness." End quote. So happiness becomes an art, and one that requires a great deal of technical training and expertise. The kitchen and the family dinner table become the space where a family's happiness, and therefore the nation's happiness, become materialized. So you can see the beginning of a shift in the relationship between happiness and food. One of the most famous cookbook authors, known as Abla Nazira, was one of the women who was sent abroad to study, and this is where she studied. She acquired her modern culinary expertise in the UK in a kitchen like this one. So, and she came back to Egypt, worked for the Ministry of Education, and wrote this cookbook, which became a household name and a very famous, sort of the joy of cooking of Egypt. So she's at the forefront of a very explicitly modernizing domestic science and cookery movement. And the interesting thing about it, if you look through the archives of this domestic science training college, the two Egyptian students were the only foreign students I saw who attended the school. But graduates of the school taught not only in England, they were mostly British students, and they went all throughout the empire to teach domestic science and modern cookery. Wherever the British Empire was, these women went out and taught. So it's a very sort of a movement of global aspirations to spread domestic science throughout the world. And in some ways, the cookbooks, these Egyptian cookbooks, adhere to the norms of modern European cookbook writing of the same era. So they're attentive to timing and regulation, standardization, efficiency of time and budget, the newest kitchen technologies like the Buddha gas stove that Layla's friend Gamila so wanted, the imposition of a nutritional paradigm whereby foods were classified into fats, proteins, and carbohydrates, and discussed in terms of vitamins and minerals and calories. And they even have a standard organization. So typically these books begin with a pantry section, a description of how a kitchen should be set up and equipped and supplied. And then they have sections with recipes for soups, vegetables, fish, poultry, meat, and dessert. So there's sort of a set order that reflects the sequencing of European meals at this time. But however global and universalizing the modern culinary discourse was, it had to be localized to be made fit for the Egyptian nation. So the first cookbook I mentioned, first women's cookbook I mentioned, published in 1934, accomplishes this in part with a section on the ancient Egyptians, including what they ate, which was of course very nutritionally well-rounded and had a lot of dishes that Egyptians still eat today, according to the cookbook. And then another cookbook, for example, talks about the importance of a housewife's cooking to the public interest in Egypt. And all of these authors situate themselves as part of the Nahda, and that their cookbooks are contributions to the national Renaissance. And so these Egyptian cookbooks were by no means carbon copies of metropolitan cookbooks. They're all written in formal Arabic or Fusha, and their authors, as I said, position them within national movements and the interests of the nation. So they include recipes for kebabs and ful mudames and mulukhia and other traditionally Egyptian foods, but they also include instructions for making classic French soups, for example. And every one that I found, every one of the 7 or 8 women's cookbooks that I found has a recipe for macaroni bechamel, which becomes a very popular Egyptian dish. It's actually an adaptation of a Greek dish called pastitsio, but of course it has the French bechamel sauce and the Italian macarona. So in some ways it's a very cosmopolitan dish, and these cookbooks are the first place that I've seen it showing up in print at least. So these texts, these cookbooks, are fascinating and accommodating and eclectic. So if the novels are narrating shifts in inner desires and subjectivities, these cookbooks I'm reading as guidebooks to sort of everyday material aspects involved with some of these same shifts. So next I want to explore how we can use both of these genres, cookbooks and novels, together in order to understand the shifting role that women play in the kitchen in affective and emotional terms. And I'd like to suggest that literary works can help us recover some of the thick description and the everyday affects, the sort of haptic material textures of the kitchen, in a way that we don't always find in the normative discourses of the periodicals and cookbooks and so forth. So I'd like to return to this sort of semantic mapping that I referenced earlier, and also draw on the insight articulated by Ian Hodder, that our desires or impulses or aversions are always for or towards or of something. That as humans, we're entangled with other humans in society, but we're also deeply entangled with things, material things. And a unique quality of affects and desires is that they can attach and reattach to new and unexpected things. So I think this offers us a way of narrating the story of the modern Egyptian kitchen and the women inside it in a way that takes into account both changing subjectivities in terms of gender and class, but also complex materialities. And the previous presentation beautifully illustrated the way that this is a period of time, happens maybe a little bit later in Egypt, but this is a period of time where material culture is changing very rapidly. The foodstuffs that are available, the materials people are cooking with change. So here on the left are the sort of affective expressions I originally discussed from the novels as these shifts are happening. And I've mapped them onto sort of new objects or ideas that are introduced by the cookbooks. So as you can see, they don't map perfectly, and they shouldn't, because the story that they're telling is much fuzzier and complex than that. But you can see how they sort of transition or complement one another in very different ways. So as one example, the term happiness, the saada, shifts from a situation in which, in the second scenario that I described in a novel like India Hashim, happiness stems from simply having enough food, or enough of the right kind of food, which in the Egyptian situation is typically food from the Egyptian countryside. And this changes over time into a situation in which a woman is responsible for producing happiness through food in a particular kind of kitchen. So happiness begins to index something new. It's produced in a different way and defined differently. Another example here is, you see this impulse. Qasim Amin publishes his treatises about the liberation of women and the status of women at the turn of the century. And within a few decades, you see publication of domestic science manuals and articles in women's journals and cookbooks that actually start to codify and explicitly explain how women should actually be educated to being modern housewives who can be companions for the husbands leading the new nation. And another example is the example of fat, which is the root semna is a very rich one and is used to describe bodies and fattening processes, but it's also clarified butter. And so fat shifts from something that's to be celebrated into something that's supposed to be regulated in new ways, and new kinds of cooking fats are introduced. And the kind of cooking fat you use in making bechamel sauce becomes very important. So these are just some examples of the way that I'm using, affective and emotional terms to read these genres against one another. So my hope is that I've begun to map out a way to understand historical processes related to gender and food on one hand, and a way of reading literary texts on the other. This is research in progress. I'm kind of just at the beginning. So I'd love to hear any thoughts or feedback you have to offer. And just here I have I do have a food blog where I cook a lot of the recipes that I discovered through my research, and then I've also got a blog where I'm kind of documenting just the research process of this project, if anybody's interested in following. So thank you very much.